in and out of the Beltway. From large cities to small towns to the rural heartland. From sea to shining sea. This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio. Inside the News.
Welcome back to the program, Inside the News. Glad to have you with us all across the country. Ben Brunson, Frank Vernuccio, myself is Guy Wehman, and we've got Frank top left and Ben Brunson in the middle. How you doing today, Ben?
I'm doing just great, Guy. It is once again a pleasure to be with you and Frank for another great show.
Absolutely. 6 years on the radio, and we are actually now a few weeks into number 6. Frank, how you doing up there?
Doing as well as you can in the socialist paradise of New York City.
I love it. Sometimes you're behind enemy lines, but now it's the paradise of socialism. Wow. Where'd you come up with that one?
Out of desperation, out of living here.
He was inspired by Nicolas Maduro, no doubt.
There you go.
There you go. All right. Well, that leads right into segment number 1 here, which is our domestic segment, and crime in America, and it's the Marxist plan. Frank, go.
Well, we've seen this story before. Whenever an authoritarian movement wants to take power, the first thing they do is create so much disorder that people become extremely distressed. And then in comes the strongman type of movement, whether it's socialism, Nazism, communism, whatever. And they say, put us in power and we'll restore order. Everything will be okay. And that's exactly what we're seeing on the streets of American cities right now. It's disorder, but disorder with a purpose. Disorder to knock down the constitutional order, knock down the legitimacy of the government. This is something we've seen since 2016, when the left said the election of Donald Trump was illegitimate. We're not going to recognize it. He's not my president and all that nonsense. This is just a continuation of that, accelerated in anticipation of the November election.
Frank, you've hit on something here. And Ben, I'm sure you have some input on this because we've talked about it on past shows, but we're seeing it escalate all across the country, Ben.
Well, actions have consequences, and unfortunately, the consequences of no longer supporting police, browbeating the police, prosecuting police for questionable actions, or in some cases, very clear self-defense actions, as in the case of the Atlanta shooting, that was clearly justified, and yet that police officer is facing murder charges as we speak. There are consequences to all of these actions. This defund the police movement sweeping through democratically controlled cities, the efforts by George Soros in recent years to fund the election of district attorneys and prosecutors. Very interestingly, I'm in Orlando. There are a series of TV ads that I have seen running in the last week for a black woman who's running for the district attorney job. And it is a very left-wing oriented. She's making her whole campaign is on ending mass incarceration and the targeting of black people by the police. It is the typical left-wing cabal. What strikes me about the ads is they're very professionally done. It is very high-end production values. And obviously, she has received funding from someone. I'm betting he is a Hungarian named George Soros. So his efforts to undermine cities across America by bringing in people like Mr. Krasner in Philadelphia, who basically stop prosecuting criminals and release people onto the streets and sow chaos and division in our cities. Unfortunately, his efforts have borne a lot of fruit. And it is up to the people to reject this. I think that is coming in November in a big wave, but it really is up to the American people to step up at this point and say enough is enough.
Ben hit on something here, Frank, about the high-end production value of these spots. And even Antifa, and you mentioned it on a past program as well, about how some well-dressed these kids are, and they are very well funded and very well organized.
Yeah, Ben brought up the point about how well-heeled these people seem to be. The illusion that the press continues to push is that the BLM and Antifa riots and activities are somehow the voice of an oppressed minority, the downtrodden and the poor. In fact, you look at the people behind these movements, and they're very well heeled, very well financed, and very well organized. And indeed, if you want to look at who is truly the grassroots folks getting involved in politics today, it's those on the conservative end of the political agenda.
Yeah, and we're going to get into what's going on in Congress and especially the schools and what's going on with the Biden campaign in sections number 3 and number 4 of the program here. But Ben, law and order, we're looking at Portland, we're looking at Chicago, you're looking at New York, and all across the country here. They want to try DC, but they have a handle on DC because Trump's not going to let it get out of control there. But law and order, it's almost disappearing in some of these cities there, Ben.
Well, I would not exclude Washington, D.C. from that. We just had a mass shooting a couple of days ago, 21 people shot in one event. Of course, this is not covered by the news. And the reason is when there's a mass shooting that doesn't involve a white loner pulling the trigger or a white kid, it is ignored by the press. And yet, according to the New York Times, about 95% of mass shootings are perpetrated by black shooters. Those were New York Times statistics published a couple of years ago, a story which I think has been deleted from the New York Times since then. This was another shooting that occurred in Washington, D.C., black shooters, black victims. So apparently it doesn't matter. Those are black lives that just don't matter whatsoever because they don't fit the political narrative. In Portland, you have an insurrection going on. This is an armed rebellion against the state. It needs to be treated as such. Frankly, we have to get to a point where the kid gloves come off, because what you're seeing in Portland is an Antifa-driven rebellion that gets more sophisticated, more heavily armed every day. The tactics being used by these kids on the streets is escalating. Their weapons they're using are escalating, and we have to get serious. We talked about naming Antifa as a terrorist organization. How has that not occurred yet? At what point do we step in to stop this armed rebellion going on in the streets of American cities?
You know, I think the president has said this is a terrorist organization, but Ben, I think you hit on an important point. It has not officially been put on the list, and that, I think, is what you're talking about, right, Ben?
That's correct. To my knowledge, it is yet to be officially designated as a terrorist organization.
All right. Frank, what about the flee from these metros? And I call it the large metros, but what is happening is that people are leaving these cities. They're going to other areas across the country. And now Cuomo and some of these people are saying, come back. Well, they're saying come back because they want their money, because these are people that have more money than the common man. I didn't want to say it quite like that, but I think you know what I'm saying, Frank.
Yeah, and I want to add on to Ben's point before I address that. The attack on the federal courthouse on the West Coast, to me, is not much different than firing on Fort Sumter, starting the Civil War. What we're seeing are not riots. What we're seeing are not protests. What we're not seeing is a political movement. What we're seeing is a rebellion. It's a secession from the Union. It is not geographical. This is not, one part of the country seceding from the Union because its regional interests are different. This is a group of people who do not believe in the Constitution. They find the Bill of Rights nothing more than an impediment to their plans. And so by violence in the cities, by making it impossible to live in portions of the country, they are indeed seceding from the Union.
Frank, let me ask you a question on that then. If this is not just regional up there in Portland, are they trying to stake a claim in that area and hoping that it's like the virus, that it spreads across the country?
I think they are, but I think if you want to look about it from a regional perspective, it's the large blue cities that are the new Confederacy, so to speak. They are the ones who are seceding from the Union. Now, you talked about people fleeing from the large cities. This is not just a reaction to the type of crime we saw in the past. This is a direct renunciation of the policies of blue mayors like de Blasio in New York, Lightfoot in Chicago, and God knows how many on the West Coast. You're also seeing a rejection of policies, just as we've seen in St. Louis, where a couple is defending their home from a mob, and it's not the people in the mob who are indicted, it's the couple defending their home.
Ben, we're seeing it because we're down here in Florida and we're starting to see the influx of people. Texas is going to have its sense of people too, because they're not only looking about the violence, but they're also looking about the taxes and how much they have to pay in that as well, Ben.
Well, economics does work. That is one thing I can guarantee. And people are reacting by voting with their feet to leave these very highly taxed blue states like California, Illinois, and New York, to move to lower tax states like Florida and Texas and Nevada. The only problem is they often bring their Democratic vote with them. So the greatest irony of all is people flee states that are in chaos because of Democratic policies and then go vote Democratic once again when they move to a place like Texas. That's something I've never quite understood. But ever since the major tax reform passed in the first 18 months of the Trump administration, which put the limit on SALT, on state and local taxes at $10,000. The American taxpayer stopped underwriting the profligate spending of states like New York and Illinois and their ridiculously high rates. California's reaction, by the way, is they're talking about increasing the already highest marginal rate in the country among states from 13.6% to as high as 16.5%. And that may very well pass into law as they seek more revenue. And they're going to chase a lot more people out.
You brought this up here, Ben, and about the taxes and them footing the bill for other things. This kind of goes into this stimulus number 4 that Pelosi and Schumer, they wanted us to bail out other states with this stimulus plan. Am I correct in that?
You're absolutely correct. What this entire battle is over in Washington is the Democrats want the next round of stimulus to bail out all of these left-wing states like California and New York that have chronically spent more than they take in for a very long time. Illinois and Chicago, the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois has been functionally bankrupt for the past decade at least, and they have no intention of changing their ways. So now they want the U.S. taxpayer to bail out these places, and that is the absolute apotheosis. That's completely wrong, and so far the Republicans are united in stopping that and standing against that type of bailout.
Let's continue on that now, Frank, because we're talking about that, but they also want to include extra money for illegal aliens, that they would be getting Medicare and all kinds of other stuff in this plan. I mean, this is unreal.
Yeah, this is not morally different than holding a gun to someone's head in a time of crisis and simply saying, do what I want or I'm going to shoot you. You look at the things that the Democrats are asking for, pushing the Green New Deal, bailing out states that have bankrupt policies that have destroyed their tax base. You go right down the list. Many of these look like funds that are going to be eventually transferred back to Democrat Party or the Democrat candidates. It is holding the needy American citizen during this time of the Chinese virus crisis hostage to the goals of the partisan goals of the Democrat Party. And I want to add one other thing as well to the economic exodus from the large cities. It's not just the taxes themselves, it's regulations that are chasing businesses out. Let me give you an example. New York City, like the rest of the country, suffered terribly under the COVID crisis. Small businesses were hit particularly hard. One would assume the logical action of a city government would be to do everything possible to help those small businesses survive the crisis. Instead, the administration of Mayor de Blasio has imposed a new host of regulations on small business, including new reporting requirements, including all sorts of new fees. So clearly, this is a government that, by any criteria, is doing everything possible to destroy business within its limits.
Okay, we have about another minute here left, Ben. Let's talk about the NRA. And there's a push going on, a renewed push about the anti-NRA movement here, Ben.
Well, back to New York. New York Attorney General Letitia James has filed a lawsuit, and her stated goal is to dissolve the NRA. And her leverage to achieve that is allegations of misappropriation of funds by NRA leadership, like Wayne LaPierre and other senior leaders. They spend too much on themselves, blah, blah, blah. And that is the basis on, in her opinion, to dissolve the entire NRA. This will never succeed. However, it has succeeded. If you weren't sure what the Democratic agenda is, to destroy the Second Amendment, to destroy your right to private gun ownership in this country, well, this is yet another data point that shows you that that is indeed what they're all about, what they're headed for. So you got to get out and vote if you care about the Second Amendment and the Bill of Rights.
This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, and we are a COVID-free broadcast. You like that, Frank? COVID-free. We're on AUN TV and affiliates all across the country. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a time out. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.